So first of all, although I'm going to give a little bit of background, for those of you who don't know all of our distinguished panelists, although I imagine we all either know them or should know them, but Peter Zeihan, who you all just heard from, and he was either terrifying or inspiring, depending on your perspective and if you had coffee this morning or not. And I'm looking forward to diving into this because, as you can see, I have lots of notes from your book. And then we have Krzysztof Krawczyk from CVC Capital Partners, who's joining us this morning as well. I know he's very familiar with Peter's writing and his work. And so we're very happy to have him in conversation with us. And then Michał Gajewski, who I thought would have a much more dramatic story about his arm. But we're thrilled. He's the CEO of Santander in Poland, and we're thrilled that you're able to join us. And then Marci Shore, who is a distinguished professor of European history at Yale, and one of the women I spoke with last night and told her I was going to be in conversation with you, is a huge fan of yours and says that you're one of the most popular professors at Yale, and that I was lucky to be in conversation, and I agree that we all get to do this. Peter, I have to tell you, inspired by you, I read your book. I just received it, and so I read it on the treadmill, because as I understand, Krzysztof knows what I'm talking about, a lot of the way that Peter informs us about the world is through his walks and so you're keeping us all healthy to tell history. And I want to thank you for writing this book and the books before, in part because I am the daughter of a political historian who raised me and said, I don't care what you do when you grow up, but study history, because to understand the past will help you make decisions as you grow up to be a leader in the world. And my mother was a demographer, is a demographer, and so my parents would really enjoy being in conversation with you, and in part because you tell us that forewarned is forearmed. And I think that's a very interesting place to start this conversation, because I confess you read the book. One reads the book, and there's a line that struck me where you said 2019 was the last great year for the world economy. And in part because America lost interest. And I'd love to use that as the jumping off point for you to explain the state of American hegemony, if you will, in the world today. You do this really, I think, excellent job of taking us down memory lane from post-World War II conversations at Bretton Woods and what's happened since then and since the Cold War. But could you just talk about America's role in the world as you see it, particularly the sort of the retreat, if you will, of our leadership?
If I had to lay this all at the feet of one group, it would probably be today the American baby boomers. For the last 40 years, they have been the singular economic and political force on the American stage. As they have their kids, as they approach retirement, as they generate the largest concentration of capital the world has ever seen. And half of them are now retired. Yeah. So the American engagement that we've seen, that a lot of Europeans, a lot of people in the world find, how should I put this, aggravating? Yeah. It's the baby boomers, it's not me. And now that they're liquidating their capital stock and moving into retirement and going from being taxpayers and capital providers to tax takers, we're moving into a very different world, because some version of that has happened everywhere. But the capital boom we experienced as a world in the 2000s and the 2010s, that's now flipping in the other direction. And if you take what used to be the most engaged and the largest of the American generations ever, and now disengage them and turn them into narcissistic retirees, it doesn't really matter what the Americans want to do. The capital is no longer there. The workforce exposure is no longer there. And retirees are notorious for being a little prickly. And that is now how American politics will be for the next decade.
Well, we're very familiar with that. But from the slides, and for those of you who are still processing this, we're sitting in Poland, we're sitting in Europe. What do you think the trends towards deglobalization, how does that impact here, this region? Because it felt quite optimistic from what I just listened to backstage.
For the sub-region, for Poland, Central Europe, I agree. For Europe as a whole, it's a different story. Most of the Western European states are well past the point of demographic reconstitution. So the story of Western Europe for the last 50 years has been one of the Americans providing the strategic overarching structure that allows globalization to persist, to exist. And the baby boomers were not retired, and the European baby boomers were not retired. So we had this wonderful moment from roughly 1960 until roughly 2019, when everyone was building, when everyone was trading, when the security environment was there, when global energy and agriculture and manufacturing could exist in a security risk-free environment. And now that's all breaking down. And when I look at a place like, say, Germany, not only are they facing the turning of the labor force, not only are they losing access to global markets because the Americans are backing away, they're also losing access to the energy and the material imports that used to come from the Russian system. So all of the pillars of Western European success are in the process of cracking. That doesn't necessarily mean all of Europe faces that, but anything that's dependent on Germany is.
Yeah, well, you referenced history, and I want to bring Marci into this conversation because you said something, Marci, when we spoke last week that made me think of my first conversation with Peter, where you said February 2022 was the decisive end of liberal democracy as we know it. The end of history is the language that you used, and Peter talks about how a lot of people who would listen to his presentations didn't understand, and then after February 22, they said, I got it. So can you explain to the audience what you mean by that?
Yes, the end of history, as I think many of you may be familiar with, was a narrative originally articulated by Francis Fukuyama in 1989. And it essentially involved replacing one Hegelian narrative, the communist Hegelian narrative, that we are proceeding inexorably, inevitably towards a communist utopia, with another Hegelian narrative, which is that we are proceeding inexorably, inevitably towards liberal democracy. Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes wrote a beautiful book about how this broke down, because there was a sense, a feeling of optimism, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that now history was on its right track. Now we know that there's no alternative to liberal democracy. And there was a sense that liberalism, as a respect for individual rights and popular sovereignty and freedom of speech and a free press, and democracy as the right of people to choose, and free market neoliberalism as free trade, that they were all part of what I think Adam Michnik had called a utopian capitalist package. And they were all leading us in a good direction. So there might be some bumps on the road, but basically we were all going in a good direction. And there were moments when that narrative was shaken. The wars in Yugoslavia, which were, again, seen as a kind of anachronistic, we'll get past that because now we're on the right tracks. And there were three moments when I felt like I was so paralyzed by world historical events that I couldn't see how we could shake ourselves out of it. And the first was being in New York on September 11th. And the second was when Trump won the election in November 2016. And the third was February 24th, 2022, which I should say on my side of the Atlantic was February 23rd because 4 a.m. Kiev time was in fact 9 p.m. New Haven time. And so we were all awake. And I understood that something had broken, and was not coming back. And it was absolutely terrifying. But I should also say that as a historian, you're always skeptical about any kind of teleological narrative because you know that there are always, now we would say, black swans. but there are always those moments of contingency. I mean, now I'm obsessively thinking about the day in November 1995 when I learned that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And now I think back, if those bullets had missed, we would be in a completely different world.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of what-ifs that often play out in history. I imagine both of you spent a lot of time being in that, having to think about that, but it's funny, sometimes we think historians also need to be prognosticators, thank you. And I certainly imagine, Peter, you feel that a lot. But Marci, one of the things that you said in an interview last year, which I found that really stayed with me, that you said you didn't believe the war could end until Putin's regime falls. And it needs to be defeated decisively, otherwise life will provoke him and no one will be safe. That was 1 year ago. How do you feel today about that statement?
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a negotiation situation. I don't think there's anything rational on the table to be negotiated. And Putin likes to kill people. He is burning through his country's resources. He is bleeding through its population. He will send out his whole population as cannon fodder. To say that that's rational requires expanding the definition of rationality to the point it's to be effectively meaningless. The areas that have fallen under Russian occupation have been such reigns of terror that it's completely morally unsustainable to ask anyone to remain in that situation. I mean, it's effectively equivalent to saying, could we ask some part of the European Jewish population to remain under Nazi occupation? I don't think that's sustainable. I think everybody lives under this reign of terror and threat until that regime falls. I think it's a 1945 kind of situation.
Well, we're talking about rational decision-making, and the two gentlemen sitting in the center of the stage have to spend a lot of their time making rational decisions in an often chaotic and irrational world, particularly with some of the decisions leaders are making, starting with the leader of Russia. But Krzysztof, I'm going to ask you, how do you see all of this play out from a business perspective over the last several years, decades? The Central and Eastern European region has seen a dramatic shift from the majority of the population employed in manual labor, and shifting to the small business economy and the tech sector. So what is the rise of nearshoring? We talked about this last week. What does that mean for economic growth in Europe, and in particularly in Poland?
Yeah, so our firm is a global investment firm that is investing long term. So when we deploy capital, we cannot really take it overnight. So the work by Peter is we are very carefully listening to. And the one overarching conclusion from our interactions, we've met in 2020 in January before the prequel to The End of the World was played. The overarching conclusion is the constant in geographies of success is gone. There is no constant. So, similarly to Spain losing its global leadership when Industrial Revolution kicked in, we are at the point when the investors need to figure out how we look for geographies of success. And the two conclusions or two challenges that we see based on the geopolitical strategist work is, first of all, we live in the world of increasing nationalism, economic nationalism. So the protectionism of countries or regions like European Union, it's only going to escalate. When you look at the wave, the tsunami of FDI restrictions that went through Europe, and in US, President Biden in 2022 increased the power of CFIUS, so a power over M&A transactions in the US. That's a signal that you better make sure that you're an ally with the geography that you put your capital in. Now, the good news for some geographies is you're an ally. So a great example is a significant investment by Intel in Poland, $4.6 billion into a semiconductors capacity, for Europe, based in Poland. Well, conveniently, they put it on the west side of Poland, so it's a little bit far from our eastern border. Yeah. But that's an example of the big investors. Maybe they're slow, but they're making decisions that they no longer want to rely on the cheapest. They want to rely on reliable and cheap.
Yeah.
I would just add real quick that the Chinese are no longer the cheapest. They've got the fastest appreciating labor costs in human history. What they've seen in the last 10 years is greater increase in labor costs than what we saw during the Black Death.
And so are Poles. So, one of the, no product placement, one of the producers of tires has decided to move productions from Poland to Romania because it's cheaper. So it's also a lesson learned for countries like Poland, that, and that's the other challenge. Peter only showed the 2025 demographics of Poland. So the base case scenario, it's not a worst case scenario, for 2060 is that there will be more people non-productive in Polish population than those productive. And not only this, there will be 6 million people less versus today. Today, Polish population is at the level of 1987. So, and unless we decide to 3 to 5 kids per family, that is a very strong signal that in picking the geographies, we need to pick the geographies that can transfer from bending metal and doing it cheaply to those that are based on intellectual property, to those that are more productive and sort of more capital intensive in terms of means of production.
Well, the geographies of success, as you write about in the book, which I found very interesting. It's definitely a chapter worth delving into because you touched on it in your panels, but the idea, the concept in my mind was almost blown when you said a messy model was potentially Russia, actually, and Japan being the other, and I think the audience would love to hear more about that. But quickly, Krzysztof, I just want to follow up on that. What do you think the role of government leaders is, particularly European government leaders, in navigating success as you decide where you're going to invest your capital?
The role? Yeah. It's massive, but is there an action? I think there is a concern that the current leaders are not stepping up. 2024 is one of these election years where more than half of the world is voting, and that also includes Europe. So I think there is I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there's a growing frustration of constituents in Europe, get to work. And it's in some geographies, I think Sweden, Hungary, of course, France, there may be a shift towards a more radical, more, unfortunately, less, federative thinking amongst the EU leaders.
Well, we are also gearing up for a big election in November in our country. For those of you who might be following U.S. elections, it's never a dull moment what's happening there. But Michał, I wanted to come to you for a moment because Poland is, as Peter started us off and Krzysztof is sharing specifically through his work, a wildly successful economic story. And so what do you think the opportunities are for Poland amidst this era of deglobalization that Peter warns us of?
Yeah, thank you. So I am really optimistic, and this is not a common thing for the commercial bankers, but really never in our history, 1,000-year history, have we been so close to the Western in terms of the growth level and the quality of life. And you can say we already see the taillights of the German Audi, and now it's the time really to catch up with it or even overtake it. And it's not me. Professor Marcin Piątkowski, professor at the Koźmiński University, said that. And, but I believe I am very close to this opinion. And deglobalization, I would say, really creates a lot of opportunity for Poland. And just to give you one example, every year, foreign investors in the global economy invest $1.3 trillion, which flow from the richest countries to the poor. And now there is a chance for Poland, because of the reasons underpinned by the facts like lessons learned from COVID, of course the growing tension between US and China, but also climate changes, and of course war in Ukraine, that we can achieve more those investments than in the past. And in fact, we were very smart to accumulate every year about 30 billion of those funds. But now, being a part of the EU, stable country, relatively stable country, with improving industry, I believe that we can inspire to attract more capital. And in fact, this is one of the facts that worries me a bit. This is the level of the investment growth in Poland. This rate to the GDP is 17%, and only 4% is a public investment, while the rest is private investment. So I believe we have a lot of room for improvement here.
So it sounds like you are hopeful for the future.
Yes, I am.
And I can't believe how quickly this panel has gone by. We could speak all morning, but I do want to ask one last round, picking up on what Michał just said, what each of you are hopeful about for the future. And Marci, I'm going to start with you.
I brought children into the world, so I have to be hopeful. Yeah. I have seen people in Ukraine do extraordinary things and find things in themselves that they wouldn't have known. And for me, one of the moments I keep looking back to is that moment of the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014, where there was a coming together, as there was in Solidarity in Poland, you know, in say 1980, of people from the right and the left, and Jews and Christians and Muslims and workers and intellectuals and parents and children, and that kind of overcoming of all sorts of divisions in a moment of solidarity and crystallization of what is worth living for and what is worth dying for. Historically, those moments last for a flicker of a second. They've never been able to be maintained. But the fact that they can happen at all is proof that we human beings are capable of that. And I hold on to that hope that we have that capacity for something better. And that's why I wake up in the morning.
Well, I mean, Peter keeps reminding us we have to keep making babies. So, Krzysztof, what about you?
Ukraine needs to win this war. We need to win this war. It's existential for Europe. And the other small thing is that I'm also a father of 4, and I hope that my daughter, who is starting as a student of history and politics in October, and some of her class, they will rule the world, because they are much more capable. They think in a much more clear way than the older generation.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Peter, please bring us home.
The last 70 years have been about the redemption, the rise, and now the fall of Germany, which has taken us on a wild ride. It's your turn now. You won't be alone. There are other countries where the demographies will hold into the future, so, learn Swedish, learn French, and the 3 of you together will decide what Germany looks like for the next 75 years.
And I have a feeling you're going to have a lot of fun with that.
You know, you said something, and I'm going to read it because there's so. First of all, I did not know that the average pair of jeans is touched by hands in at least 10 countries before we wear them. Thank you for that fact. And if we want to get a pair of bedazzled jeans, apparently we have to like go to space and back. But, you know, I appreciated that you sort of end your book with a call to action to some of our, you know, our European leaders, particularly as it relates to the war in Ukraine. But are you hopeful about where that?
We will get through this. This is not the first time we've tangled with a bully, and they're dying. We will live to see the other side of this.
Well, that is certainly a hopeful way to end our first panel. Thank you for joining us, all of our distinguished panelists. Thank you all for listening. And we're on to the next panel. Thank you. Thank you all.